The biggest mistake in American history. Right now, I am going to tell you about the biggest mistake in American history. Not a war, not a scandal, not a president who lied. I'm talking about one decision made by a small group of tired men in a marble room that changed the fate of millions of people who had not even been born yet. This decision did not make headlines like a war does. There was no explosion, no gunshot, no burning building. It was quiet. It was almost boring. It happened with pens and paper and long speeches that put people to sleep. And that is exactly why it worked. That is exactly why it slipped past almost everyone. That is exactly why, more than 100 years later, most Americans have never even heard of it. But here's the truth. If this one decision had gone the other way, World War II might never have happened. The Holocaust might never have happened. Tens of millions of lives might have been saved. I'm not going to tell you what this decision was yet. I want you to feel it first. I want you to walk through the years that led up to it, so that when I finally say the words, you understand exactly what was lost. Stay with me until the end. I promise you, it will change the way you see your own country. The world before the mistake. To understand this mistake, you have to go back to a world soaked in blood. The year is 1918. For 4 straight years, young men across Europe have been dying in mud, in trenches, in fields turned into graveyards. This war is so terrible that people are calling it the war to end all wars. They do not even have a number for it yet. There has never been another war like it, so they just call it the Great War. By the time it ends, more than 16 million people are dead. Soldiers, children, mothers, fathers, entire villages wiped off the map, entire generations of young men simply gone. Picture a small town. Picture the town square. Now picture almost every young man from that square never coming home. That is what Europe looked like in 1918. America joined this war late. American soldiers, called doughboys, crossed the ocean and fought in the final year. They came home as heroes. They came home changed. And they came home believing something important. They believed this could never be allowed to happen again. One man believed this more than almost anyone else on earth. His name was Woodrow Wilson. He was the President of the United States, and he had a plan so bold, so hopeful that some people called him a dreamer, and others called him a saint, and others called him dangerously naive. Wilson believed the only way to stop another war like this one was to build something the world had never had before. A place where countries could talk instead of fight. A place where small nations would not get crushed by big ones. A place where, if one country attacked another, the whole world would step in together to stop it. He called this idea the League of Nations. Think of it like a giant neighborhood watch. Except instead of watching for burglars, the countries of the world would watch for wars. If one country tried to invade another, the League would respond. Not just one army, many armies standing together saying, "Not this time." It sounds simple now, but in 1918 it was a radical idea. For thousands of years, when a country wanted more land, more power, more resources, it simply took them by force. Nobody stopped it, unless another army was strong enough to fight back. Wilson wanted to change that forever. He sailed to Paris in December of 1918, and hundreds of thousands of French people lined the streets to cheer for him. Children threw flowers, grown men wept. They called him Wilson the Just. They believed he was the man who would finally make peace permanent. Nobody had ever seen an American president treated like this on foreign soil. He was not just a politician to them. He was hope itself, wearing a coat and a hat. But back home in Washington, D.C., something dangerous was already growing, and it had nothing to do with Europe. It had to do with pride and fear, and one man who hated Woodrow Wilson so much that his hatred would end up shaping the next century. The man who tried to stop it. His name was Henry Cabot Lodge. Lodge was a senator from Massachusetts. He was smart, he was proud, and he could not stand Woodrow Wilson. Some of this was about politics. Lodge was a Republican. Wilson was a Democrat. But it went deeper than party lines. It was personal. Lodge thought Wilson was arrogant. He thought Wilson believed he was better than everyone else, smarter than everyone else, chosen by history itself to save the world. And the truth is, Wilson kind of did believe that. Wilson was a former college professor. He talked to senators the way a professor talks to students who have not done the reading. He rarely asked for their opinions. He rarely invited them into the process. He believed his plan was so obviously good that anyone who disagreed with it must be small-minded, or selfish, or simply wrong. This was going to cost him everything. Here is something you need to understand about how the United States government works. A president can negotiate a treaty with other countries. He can shake hands. He can sign his name. But that treaty means nothing, absolutely nothing, unless 2/3 of the United States Senate votes to approve it. Wilson negotiated the treaty that would end World War I in Paris. It was called the Treaty of Versailles. Buried inside that treaty, woven into its very bones, was Wilson's dream, the League of Nations. But Wilson made a mistake before he even got on the boat to France. He did not bring a single Republican senator with him to the peace talks. Not one. He brought Democrats. He brought friends. He brought people who already agreed with him. Back home, the Senate was controlled by Republicans. And the man in charge of that Senate, the man who would decide whether this treaty lived or died, was Henry Cabot Lodge. Wilson had left his most important rival out of the room, and now he was asking that same rival to simply trust him and vote yes. Lodge was not going to make it that easy. When Wilson came home and presented the treaty to the Senate, Lodge did not reject it outright. That would come to matter enormously. Instead, Lodge did something slower, something almost sneaky. He stalled. He held hearings that went on for weeks. He read the entire 264-page treaty out loud to the Foreign Relations Committee, word for word, just to slow things down and let public opinion cool off. Then he proposed changes, 14 of them. He called them reservations. The biggest reservation was about one part of the League of Nations agreement, a section called Article 10. Article 10 was the heart of the whole idea. It said that if one member country was attacked, all the other member countries agreed to help protect it. This was the entire point. This was the not this time promise. Without Article 10, the League of Nations was just a debate club. With it, the League had real teeth. But Lodge and many other senators looked at Article 10 and saw something terrifying. They imagined a future where some small country on the other side of the world got invaded, and suddenly American soldiers were forced to go fight and die there, whether Congress wanted to or not. They believed only Congress should have the power to declare war, not some international organization sitting in Europe. This fear had a name. It still has a name today. It is called isolationism, the belief that America should protect itself, focus on itself, and stay out of the endless quarrels of foreign countries. America was still exhausted from World War I. More than 100,000 American soldiers had died in a war that started in Europe over a conflict most Americans could not even explain. Many senators looked at Article 10 and thought, never again will we let some faraway country drag us into a war. So Lodge offered Wilson a deal. Change Article 10. Add clear limits. Make it so Congress always keeps the final say on sending American troops anywhere. Do this, and the treaty passes. The League of Nations happens. America joins. It seems like such a small thing to ask. A few changes to some legal language, a compromise. And this is where the story takes its saddest turn. Wilson said no. The vote that changed everything. Woodrow Wilson refused to compromise, not because the changes would have destroyed his idea. Most historians who study this today believe the League of Nations could have survived Lodge's changes just fine. Other countries would likely have accepted an America that joined with a few conditions attached. Wilson refused because of pride, because of exhaustion, because he had given everything, absolutely everything, to this dream, and he could not stomach the idea of Henry Cabot Lodge getting credit for improving it. He said the treaty needed to be ratified exactly as he had written it, with no changes at all. His closest advisors begged him to bend. His own wife begged him to bend. Nearly everyone around him could see the treaty was about to fail unless he gave a little. Instead, Wilson decided to go over the Senate's head completely. He decided to take his case directly to the American people. In September of 1919, Wilson boarded a train and began a cross-country speaking tour. He planned to visit 29 cities in 22 days, giving passionate speeches in each one, hoping to build so much public pressure that the Senate would have no choice but to ratify his treaty exactly as written. He was 62 years old. He had already suffered small strokes that his doctors kept secret from the public. His staff pleaded with him to slow down, to rest, to take care of himself. He refused. He believed with everything in his soul that this was the most important thing he would ever do. He believed the future of the entire world depended on it. He gave speech after speech after speech. In city after city, he stood in front of massive crowds, some of them in the tens of thousands, and he pleaded with ordinary Americans to understand what was at stake. In one of these speeches, in Pueblo, Colorado, he told the crowd something haunting. He said that if America refused to join the League of Nations, another war was coming. Not someday, soon. He said he could see it, like a storm on the horizon, and it would be far worse than the last one. He was right. He just did not live to see how right he was. That night in Pueblo, after the speech, Wilson collapsed. His staff rushed him back to Washington on the train, canceling the rest of the tour. Days later, in the White House, Woodrow Wilson suffered a massive stroke. The entire left side of his body went paralyzed. For a time, he could not speak. He could not walk. He could barely see. For months, almost nobody in the country knew how sick their president really was. His wife, Edith Wilson, and his doctor quietly took over decisions, deciding what he would see, what he would sign, what the world would be told. Some historians call this period one of the strangest and most secretive in the history of the American presidency. A president incapacitated and almost no one outside a tiny circle allowed to know the truth. And through all of this, the treaty sat in the Senate, waiting for a vote. In November of 1919, the Senate voted on the treaty with Lodge's changes attached. From his sickbed, barely able to move, Wilson sent word to his loyal Democrats, vote no, reject any version with changes. All or nothing. The treaty failed. In March of 1920, the Senate tried one more time. Again, Lodge's version, with reservations attached, came up for a vote. Again, enough Democrats followed Wilson's wishes and voted no, joining a smaller group of senators who opposed the League entirely no matter what. The treaty failed a second time, this time for good. The United States of America never joined the League of Nations. Not with changes, not without them, never. Picture that room, picture the paper, picture the final tally being read aloud, and somewhere in the White House, a broken man lying in bed, unable to speak clearly, having just watched his life's greatest dream collapse because he could not bring himself to bend, even a little. The League of Nations was born anyway, without America. It opened its doors in Geneva, Switzerland. Other countries joined. But the most powerful nation on earth, the nation whose president had invented the entire idea, was not in the room. A watchdog with no teeth, a fire alarm with no fire department to call. The price of silence. For a while it seemed like maybe it did not matter. The 1920s in America were loud and bright and hungry for fun. People wanted to forget the war, not think about foreign treaties. Jazz music played, the economy boomed. Nobody wanted to talk about some organization in Switzerland. But across the ocean, something was quietly rotting. The League of Nations, without America's economic power, without America's military strength, without America's voice, turned out to be almost exactly what Lodge's critics feared it might be with Article 10 intact, and exactly what Wilson's supporters feared it would be without America. It was weak. It had rules, but no muscle behind them. In 1931, Japan invaded a region of China called Manchuria. The League of Nations condemned it. Japan simply walked out of the League and kept the land anyway. Nothing happened. In 1935, Italy invaded a country in Africa called Ethiopia. The League voted for some weak economic penalties. Italy ignored them and kept fighting. Nothing happened. In Germany, a broken and humiliated nation, crushed under war debt from the very treaty Wilson had signed, a furious and hateful man was rising to power. His name was Adolf Hitler, and he watched very closely as country after country broke the rules of the League of Nations and faced no real punishment at all. He learned a lesson from all of it. The lesson was this: nobody is actually going to stop me. In 1936, Hitler sent troops into a demilitarized area along the German border, breaking the treaty. Nothing happened. In 1938, he annexed Austria. Nothing happened. Later that year, he took part of Czechoslovakia. World leaders met and let him keep it, hoping it would satisfy him. It did not. In September of 1939, Hitler invaded Poland. This time, war finally came. World War II had begun. By the time it ended, 6 years later, more than 70 million people were dead. Soldiers, civilians, children. Entire cities burned to ash in a single night. And at the center of it all, one of the darkest chapters in all of human history, the Holocaust, where 6 million Jewish people, along with millions of others, were murdered in the most systematic and horrifying way imaginable. Now, I want to be careful here, because history is never quite as simple as one single domino falling and knocking down every domino after it. World War II had many causes. The harsh terms of the Treaty of Versailles itself, the worldwide economic collapse of the Great Depression, deep and ancient hatreds, the specific evil of specific men. No single decision creates a war like that all on its own. But historians who study this era closely keep coming back to the same haunting question. What if America had been in that room in Geneva? What if the world's strongest economy and military had stood behind the League of Nations from the very beginning? What if, when Japan invaded Manchuria, American ships had been part of the response? What if, when Italy invaded Ethiopia, American economic power had actually enforced the penalties? What if, when Hitler broke treaty after treaty? After treaty, he had been looking across the table at an America that was already standing there, arms crossed, ready to act? We will never know for certain. That is the terrible thing about history. You cannot run the experiment twice. But we do know this. The League of Nations, without America, was a lion with its teeth pulled out, and the men who caused the most suffering in the 20th century, they noticed. They tested the fence over and over and found it was never actually electrified. The ghosts. We still live with Woodrow Wilson, died in 1924, a broken man, still convinced he had been right, still convinced history would prove it. In a strange, terrible way, he was right. History did prove it. It just took the deaths of tens of millions of people to do it. After World War II finally ended, world leaders sat down again in the ashes of everything and tried once more to build something like the League of Nations. This time, they called it the United Nations. And this time, America did not make the same mistake twice. The United States joined the United Nations from the very first day. In fact, America pushed to have the United Nations headquartered right in New York City, a permanent symbol that this time, the United States would not walk away from the table. It is almost as if the entire country, all at once, without ever quite saying it out loud, learned the lesson that Woodrow Wilson and Henry Cabot Lodge had refused to learn together 25 years earlier. But here's the part that should break your heart. The lesson had already been available. It had been sitting right there in 1919 and 1920, waiting for two proud men to simply bend a little, to compromise, to put their egos aside for just long enough to save a world they could not yet see coming. Wilson refused to accept small changes to his perfect dream. Lodge refused to let Wilson have a total victory. And somewhere in between their stubbornness, an idea that might have prevented the deadliest war in human history quietly died on the floor of the United States Senate. Two men. Their pride, their pain, their refusal to give an inch. And the bill for that refusal was paid, decades later, by people who had not even been born yet. Soldiers storming beaches in Normandy, families hiding in attics in Amsterdam, children in Hiroshima. An entire generation that never got the chance to grow old, because two powerful men in 1919 could not agree to compromise. This is not a comfortable story. It does not have a villain wearing a black hat, twirling a mustache. It has two men who, in many ways, believed they were doing the right thing. Wilson believed compromise would gut his dream. Lodge believed unchecked promises would drag American boys into wars that were not theirs to fight. Neither one of them was purely wrong. And that is exactly what makes this so devastating. Sometimes, the biggest mistakes in history do not come from evil people making evil choices. They come from proud people refusing to bend at exactly the moment bending mattered most. The reveal. So now you know the whole story. You watched a war so terrible it was called the War to End All Wars. You watched a president dream of a way to make sure it really was the last one. You watched a rival senator try to add reasonable safety limits to that dream. You watched that same president, sick and exhausted and too proud to compromise, refuse those limits completely. You watched the vote fail, not once, but twice. And you watched, years later, exactly the war that President had begged the world to prevent. The biggest mistake in American history was the United States Senate's rejection of the Treaty of Versailles, and with it, America's refusal to join the League of Nations in 1919 and 1920. It was not a battle, it was not a bomb, it was a vote. Two votes, actually. Quiet, procedural, almost invisible, buried in a Senate chamber while most Americans were busy living their ordinary lives, going to work, raising their children, never imagining that a decision made that day would help shape whether their grandchildren would grow up in a world at war. That is what makes it the biggest mistake of all. It did not look like a mistake at the time. It looked like caution. It looked like patriotism. It looked like two reasonable sides simply disagreeing the way people disagree in government every single day. But this disagreement had a cost that history would not present the bill for right away. It waited 20 years. It waited until tanks rolled into Poland, until cities burned, until the true horror of the Holocaust came fully into the light, and until 70 million human beings had lost their lives. Every single time you hear about a country working with other countries to stop a war before it starts, every single time you hear about the United Nations stepping in somewhere in the world, you are looking at the shadow of this old wound. America learned, the hardest way imaginable, exactly what it costs to walk away from the table. Woodrow Wilson stood in Pueblo, Colorado, sick and dying, and warned everyone that another war was coming if America turned its back on the world. Nobody wanted to believe him. It felt too big, too far away, too abstract. 20 years later, it stopped being abstract for anyone. So here is what I want you to take from this. Big mistakes rarely feel big in the moment. They feel like small arguments. They feel like stubbornness. They feel like two proud people who simply cannot bring themselves to say, "You are right, let's meet in the middle." But history has a long memory, and it always eventually presents the bill. If you learned something today, if this story moved you even a little, remember it. Remember Wilson on that train, giving speech after speech with a body that was already failing him. Remember Lodge, holding firm to his 14 reservations. Remember that room and that vote and the quiet, terrible cost of pride. Because the biggest mistakes are never the loud ones. They are the quiet ones, the ones that walk out of a room looking like nothing at all and only show their true size decades later in the lives that were never lived and the futures that were never allowed to happen. That is the biggest mistake in American history, and now you will never forget it.